welcome to my video. So in this video I would like to design you guys about a few era in English literature history for my final examination. So I hope you guys listen it well and understand it well. So let me introduce you. The first question is, what did you learn from this class, and what the lesson and the material I've got in this class is start from 18th century era. And for the characteristic of this era, an 18th century can we call as the age of the reason, is to seize on the useful half-truth, but to cause confusion and in the general pictures, because the primacy of the reason had also been marked of certain periods of the previous age. And the second one, for the rational impulse, fostered satire, argument with plain prose, and the other inspired the psychological novel and the poetry sublime. And the third one, for the characteristic, is the early of English novel. And the next, the literature at that era, as we can see, the first one is for the rational impulse, foster satire, argument with plain prose, and the other inspired psychological novel and poetry. And this is the age of the early of the novel. The second one is the literature during this period was often considered a tool for the advancement of knowledge. The writers in this era are often found observing nature in their attempts to express their belief, and this is the age of the satire was born. And for the authors of the works at that era, the first one we can see there's Jonathan Swift with his two greatest satires they are A Tale of the Top and the Gulliver Travels that we know. And the second one, there is Daniel Defoe with his famous work Robinson Crusoe, and Alexander Pope with his satirical and discursive poetry, The Rape of the Lock and The Dunciad. So we move to the Romantic era. And for this era, the characteristic of it, they are includes subjectivity and emphasize on individualism, spontaneity, freedom of the rules, a solitary life rather than life in society, the beliefs that imagination is superior to reason, and devotion to beauty. And then there is love of and worship of nature, the fascination with the past, especially the myths and mysticism of the Middle Age. And then for the characteristic of the works in this era, the first one is individuality and the personal freedom. The second one is spiritual and supernatural elements, that is as a critical umbrella of term Gothic that has been taken to cover a number of anomalous texts which allow both of conference and for the conflict of the natural and supernatural. And the third one, as we know, in this era, nature as a teacher, and the interest of the past history or ancient Greek and Roman and folks of the period about the 1805 to 1830s was marked by a quickening of cultural nationalism and a new attention to national origins as attested by the collection and imitation of native folklore, folk ballads and poetry, folk dance and music, and even previously ignored medieval and Renaissance works. And another characteristic is the use of common language, the use of the common subjects, idealist woman that we can see in Mary's work. Mary told the adorned, laconic, and matter of the fake way, which a style with a periodic recourse to irony might almost to be described as perfunctory. And another one is another characteristic is the frequent use of personification and examination of poet inner feeling. So yeah, that's all about the characteristic of the works and a romantic era. And for the authors and the works and their works at that era, as we know, the Frankenstein's authors, Mary Shelley, and then there's Jane Austen with her famous work Pride and Prejudice, and there is John Keats with his famous works too, Ode to Nightingale. And so we move to the Victorian era, and actually high Victorian era. And for the characteristic of this era, there are the Queen Victoria, after whom the period between 1837 and to 1901 that has been referred to as the Victorian era, and that was a landmark period of the history of the Great Britain. The Victorian era saw a changing of landscape to one burgeoning industry and factories. There are also a shift from romantic ideals of the previous age toward a more realistic and acceptance and depiction of the society. And the best known Victorian scientific development is the theory, a famous theory that we know until now. This is the theory of evolution by Charles Darwin. And for the literature at that era, or the characteristic of the works in that era, the first one, the industrialization. All Victorians were seeing a major changes from the manufacturing booms, and it's hard to escape the stuff if we read many 19th century novels or poems. And also the edge of Victorian era is characterized as a practical and materialistic, but most of the writers exact a purely ideal life. The authors and the works at the era that's well known. The first one, there is Charles Dickens with his work Oliver Twist or The Paris Boy Progress, and A Tale of Two Cities. And the second one, there is Charlotte Bronte with her work Jane Eyre. And for the late Victorian era, for the characteristic in this era is this period covers the later half on the 19th centuries, and for a portion of the true reign of Britain's Queen Victoria, which is in this era named. The second one is developments of new education, the revolt, industrial revolution. For the literature in this era, the late Victorian fiction might express doubt and uncertainties, but in aesthetic terms, it displays with new sophistication and self-confidence. And the realism continued to flourish, however, sometimes encouraged the, by the example of the European realists and naturalist novelists. And in 1890s, so the intense concern with the social role of women, it is reflected in the new woman fiction of Grant Allen. For the title is The Woman Who Did, and Sarah Grant with her title Birds, Heavenly Twins, and George Egerton keynotes. The heroine of such text breach a conventional assumption by supporting women's suffrage, smoking, adopting rational dress, and rejecting traditional double standard in sexual behavior. And the last one is a gap start to open between the popular fiction and the literary or art novel. The flowering of realist fiction was accompanied, perhaps in the inevitability, by a revival of its opposite, the romance. And as we can see here, the authors and their famous works in this era, there is Thomas Hardy with his work Desperate Remedies, The Mayor of Casterbridge, and the second one there is George Eliot with her work Middlemarch. And as we can see here, after Queen Victoria's death, her eldest son, Prince Edward VII, immediately ascended the throne. His brief reign lasts only 9 years, from 91 to 1910, but the Edwardian era is seen by the most historians to include both of his children as a Prince of Wales until the start of the First World War in 1914. The kings, and for another characteristic for this era is the king's taste of fashion helped this era shape the jewelry design and fashion trends. Because of his influence began at the tail end of Victorian era and extended well into the First World War. And King Edward managed to foster a good international relation with his neighboring European countries, most notably with a Britain's traditional enemy like France, and this earned him a title, the peacemaker. And the civil rights and anti-imperial movement were commonplace during this era. And in 1918, the British people saw a more aggressive resistance from a women's group during the Edwardian era. There was also growing a number of educated women who took place in political and social causes. And for the literature in this era, as we can see here, the imagination and futurism were becoming very apparent in Edwardian literature and in Edwardian novels. And the realism also come in varying form, whether it be through colonial adventures by those Joseph Conrad and E.M. Foster, or through the finer sense of stable humor by P.G. Wodehouse. The literary criticism and short story also achieved the popularity in this age or this era. And then the Edwardian writers create a protagonist who look introspectively and though critical about the moralism and technological advance. of the previous era. And also, some novels published in Edwardian era encourage the xenophobia for fears embedded in Victorian era thinking. This is a great deal books aim to find spiritual freedom which manifests itself in liberating oneself from society's rule and liberating oneself from the shame and embarrassment inherent in rejecting community values. And we can see here the authors and their famous work in Edwardian era. And we are here in modernism era. And for the characteristic in this era, there is a break with the past and the concurrent search for new forms of expression, which is the modernism fostered a period of experimentation in the arts form from the late 19th to the mid 20th century, particularly in the years following World War I, and in the era characterized by industrialization, a rapid social change, and the advance in science and social science. And there is no such thing as absolute truth. All the things are relative. Yes. And for the literature in modernism era, the modernist writers were fascinated with how individuals adapt to the changing world. The writers present the world or society as a challenge to the integrity of their characters. And for the modernist writers broke free of all of the old form and the techniques. Poet abandoned the traditional rhyme, shame and scheme, and wrote a free verse. And also the novelist defied all the expectation. Writers makes image from the past with the modern language and the themes, and creating a college of styles. And as you can see here, for the modernist famous author and their works in that era, there is T.S. Eliot with the work long poem The Wasteland, and James Joyce with his work Ulysses, and also there is Virginia Woolf with her work Mr. Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. So we are in 20th century era, and for the characteristic of this era, that is start from 19th to 1998, which is the first one, the period that was marked by two world wars, by a great worldwide economic depression, with a dissolution of the British Empire, by increasing democratization of society, and by the advent of new technologies. And for the literature at that era, the first one is fragmented structure. Prior to the 20th century, literature tends to be structured in linear chronological order, and the 20th century writers experimented with other kinds of structure. The second one is the 20th century saw the birth of the ironic narrator, who could be not trusted with the facts of narrative. But the modernist and the postmodern writers, however, believe that this did a disservice to reliability of stories in general. And also in 20th century is distinguished as the century urbanism, as more people moved to the city in Europe and America, and also the novelists used the urban environment as the backdrop of the story they told. And for you know that the authors and their works in this era, there is Ernest Miller Hemingway with his work A Farewell to Arms, and as we know, the authors of the famous work The Lord of the Rings, there is J.R.R. Tolkien. So we are here in 21st century era, and for the condition of this 21st century era, it refers to word literature in prose produced during a 21st century. The range of years in 21st century literature was written from roughly in the year 2001 to the present now. And the contemporary issues such as global warming and international conflict received attention, and writers were still more disposed to look back. It also displayed another preoccupation of the 21st century's early years, like the imitation of earlier literary styles and techniques. And also, although they had entered to the new millennium, writers seem to find a greater imaginative stimulus in the past than in the present and in the future. And in the poetry, numerous voices we heard some praise for imagery, philosophy, or arresting technique. And for the authors and their works, in this era that I found, there is Paul Adam. He is an English writer of novels for adult and younger readers with his work The Shadow Chaser, Genesis 2, Flashpoint, Eka Oracle Lake. And then the second one, there is Simon Bestwick. This is an author of British contemporary horror with his work Let's Drink to the Dead, Solaris, and Condemned. And also there is the last but not least, there is Elizabeth Chadwick, who is with her work The Greatest Night and The Scarlet Lions that brought her to international acclaim. So after the number one explanation, we are here in number two, that is, what was the lesson learned of this class? So for the 18th century era, from what I've learned from this era is the appearance of the modern novel. This invention generally credit the novel is a story which more natural and more harmony with our experience of life, such as definition to faulty is valuable, that in the points of the elements of imagination as the distinguished mark between the romance and true novel, and it's also I've got known better to Daniel Defoe, which I just know his name, but I don't know what he has done to the development of English literature, which is he is the first true master of the English novel and has only limited validity, and his prose fiction produced in his late middle age sprang from the experimental involvement in other literary forms, and most notably the polemic pamphlet and the biography, the history, and laterally the travel book, travel books. His novel include the elements all of this form. And then the lesson that I've got after I learned this era is how the development of the novel and the prevalence of satire and the classicism in literature. And for romantic era, in this era, I know that in this period is the movement was characterized by a celebration of nature and the common man. a focus of individual experience and personal feeling, an idealization of women, and an embrace of isolation and melancholy. And the lesson that I've got too in this era is how the authors of this era put more personal thought and feeling to the words. It's kind of big different from the era before. And the Victorian era, I just make it in one explanation, height and late. From what I know is in this era is how the thinking patterns of people change, and I think it's more realistic and than romanticism. People who believe to the various theories of church all their lives were challenged with new nation of science. Charles Darwin, with his creation of human theory, with development in the field of science, a lot of new things were happen in the political scenario, which is directly and indirectly change the social thing as well. So the social ranks makes it different from high class to the lower class, and also that I got in this era is how to balancing the faith with the science and the movement and with the science and the faith. There is a lot of innovation in this world, but it could make us complacent. But we have to balance that thing. And for the Edwardian era, the beginning of the Edwardian era is from 91 to 1914, marked the end of the longest reign in British history on that after Queen Victoria's death. With this advent of new monarchs and a new century, Edwardian writers create a protagonist who look introspectively and through the critical about the modernism and technological advance of the previous era. In this era too, King Edward managed to foster a good international relation, which is make him as a peacemaker of Britain's. And in this era, and this is also make him a title, the peacemaker. And also in this era is the rise of women change took a politic and social cause rise up, which is there's a lot of good thing happen in this era through the region just for 9 years actually. And for modernism era, in this era I've learned that the rise of relativeness in human point of view, and there is no absolute truth that birth in this era. The first hint at the particular way of thinking called modernism stretched back to the 19th century. As the literary periods go, modernism displays a relatively strong sense of the cohesion and similarity across the genre and the locales. Furthermore, the writers who adopt the modern points of view often did so quite deliberately and self-consciously. Indeed, a central preoccupation of modernism is with the inner self and consciousness. And for the 20th century era, in this era, the lesson that I've got is the counts is count this era counted start in the post World War II era various reactions of two modernism including postmodernism appear with all the literary periods when we later come to see as a signal of the characteristic is not always immediately evident as this is not always neatly contained within the set of the dates. In this era, imagism and modernism flourished the period between the two world wars. And the last but not least, there is a 21st century era as the product of 20th century. I might find it even more difficult to make a definite statement about this period and especially since many ways of 20th century is still with us and still be part of us today. And also we know the range of 21st century literature was written from roughly a year 2001, which is the year that I birth, and to the present. And the contemporary issues in this century is such as a global warming and international conflict receive attention. And number 3, what is the next plan after joining this class? Okay, for the next plan after joining this class, actually, I like history subject since I was school, and math this class make me want to learn more about the history, actually in history of literature, and also it make me want to more learn about the literature not only in English. So yeah, that make me make my make me curious and make me want to learn more. And the thing that I've got is the importance of literature in this world, and that make me want to open my mind by read and watch the works from each era to see the historical background from the works. And actually, I think this is a good way of learning history by read the works at that era. So there is a lot of writers write the works based on the historical background. So I think I can get two things from learn English literature history. The first one is to entertain me, and the second one to get a historical what can I say, historical knowledge. So the plan that I've got, the next plan I want to do after this class is learn more about literature history, and then be a good student too. And I hope I got a good score in this class.